Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Super excited to welcome Ryan Faer onto the podcast today. Ryan is a certified strength and conditioning specialist and sports science analyst with the Cleveland Guardians baseball team. He's going into his third season as the sports science analyst for the Guardians. Prior to the 2022 season, Ryan spent 5 years serving as a performance coordinator for the Guardians, where he worked to support the strength and conditioning efforts and staff. He spent over a dozen years in the world of sports performance with stops in and out of professional baseball, college setting, and the high school setting. Today, Ryan and I are going to be discussing how to apply a more holistic look at your athletes in the world of sports science and rehab. So what kind of things matter, what kind of things don't matter, and how to kind of balance the subjective with the objective and paint it all together into a really nice assessment. So I think Ryan and I cover a lot of ground in this episode, and I know you're going to love it and learn something. So enjoy. Ryan, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, Dan, appreciate you having me. Super excited for the conversation.
So for people who might not be familiar with you, or maybe they haven't, seen your Instagram, or maybe they don't know your backstory, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things that you get to do on the day-to-day?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try not to be super long-winded on myself here, but I guess where I'm at right now, I'm currently finishing up my second year as a sports science analyst with the Cleveland Guardians. For those that may not follow baseball as closely, we used to be the Cleveland Indians, now the Guardians. Prior to these 2 years, I spent 5 years as one of our performance coordinators, which essentially was a strength and conditioning coordinator role with us, so helping to oversee and support the S&C department on the minor league side for our organization. So did that for 5 years. Going back before that, I'd spent 1 year at a little over 1 year at DeLand High School in DeLand, Florida, which is my alma mater. It's where I went to high school. Started their strength and conditioning program there. And that was after spending several years jumping in and out of professional baseball with a couple other organizations. So the LA Dodgers, the New York Mets, just trying to find my footing in what I, enjoyed most about this profession and working with athletes. So I ended up going back to the high school game quite a lot in between those stops to try to figure out a way to make the biggest impact that I possibly could. But ultimately ended up back here with the Guardians, and it's the longest stay that I've had anywhere. Rarely had spent more than a year anywhere else, not because of those stops that I made, but because I got homesick really quickly. So it's tough to be away from family and home. But, over the last 7 years now, gosh, I've been able to find a family and a home here as well. So that's the short version. I typically tend to get a lot more long-winded, but I'm going to spare y'all of that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it sounds like you've got a really great focus on giving back and having a positive impact on the community that you're in, Ryan. I'm curious, though, how did you get involved in the world of baseball? Was that something you grew up with, or?
Yeah, for sure. So I was the kid that we probably preach against when it comes to youth development. So I played baseball from 4 years old until 18 years old, year round, and it was the only sport I ever played. So I was the early sports specialization poster child, except I didn't quite get the abilities that some other athletes get when you're hyper specialized with one specific sport. So I played all through high school, and then when I graduated from DeLand High School, right at that same time when I graduated, a new coaching staff came in at the high school. I stayed local for school. I spent 1 year at the local community college trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do sports journalism or if I wanted to go into exercise phys. So I did 1 year at the community college to complete my AA while I figured that out. And then eventually went to the University of Florida and was able to stay local while I was doing that and did exercise science. But right when I graduated from high school, that new coaching staff was actually getting a tour of the facilities, and I had been working out in the weight room the summer after I graduated with the assistant principal, who was a good friend of mine. I introduced myself to the new head coach at the time, who was Andy Lyon. He's now at Oviedo High School nearby, and just said, "Hey, I'm going to be around for a little while. I just finished playing. I'd love to help out in any way that I can." And he said, "Okay, well, do you want to throw batting practice to our freshman team tomorrow?" I had never thrown batting practice before in my life, but I said sure, and it's kind of like the rest is history, so to speak. I've basically not left the baseball field ever since. So I coached at DeLand High School as a volunteer all through my undergrad. So all day, every day was on baseball fields and in weight rooms while I completed my undergrad. And then, again, just stayed in baseball basically the rest of the way. Jumped in and out a little bit and dabbled in some others, but always found my way back to baseball.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's incredible, Ryan. And I love that little backstory and how everything got worked together there for you. And I also want to take a second and recognize that you transitioned from strength and conditioning over into a more sports science based role. I'm curious, what exactly did that entail or look like, or what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, no, for sure. And it was definitely I wouldn't say a tough transition, but it was one I didn't expect. That's probably the best way to put it. I thought I was going to stay in strength and conditioning my whole career, and that was my upbringing. And so essentially we got to a point within our organization where we had a lot of people doing what I would call sports science things over the years. We all wore a lot of hats, and as we grew, one of the many areas that we found that we kind of tipped over and needed some more specialized resources and dedicated resources was sports science. So after 5 years in that performance coordinator role, we fully developed a sports science department headed up by our director, Jonathan Freeston, who came over from Australia. He was a professor at the University of Sydney there, came over. He's heading up the department here now. And then we actually plucked several, essentially mostly just strength coaches to make up the department. At the time, there were 4 of us under Jonathan Freeston's direction. There's 3 of us right now. And so that transition went from, in some ways, it was a very, my day-to-day looks very similar in that I'm still in the weight room all day, every day. And the office that I work in is the same exact strength and conditioning office that I was in before. I just kind of moved seats. So I'm around the athletes just as much. It wasn't as much of a transition as I thought it would be in that sense, but what I'm doing in terms of interacting with the athletes and where it's anchored is different. So I spend a lot more time with our assessments, with workload monitoring, where early on I was doing a lot of that, and our S&C staff as a whole was doing that while also trying to coach. At this point now, our S&C staff is focused on programming and coaching and doing those things at the highest level possible. And then those of us in the sports science department are now doing those sports science things, I guess you could say, that we were doing before, but we're trying to do that at a very high level as well. So again, still spending my whole day around athletes and coaches and interacting with them in a very similar way, but at the same time, just, I guess you would say, just narrowing in on one area or several areas as opposed to really everything that the sports performance field has to offer.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the area of sports science is very quickly evolving here. And there's a lot we know and a lot we don't know. I keep seeing these force plates pop up in a lot of different places. I'm a huge fan of the vertical jump mat myself and using that for kind of a quick and easy way to assess different things. So I'm very excited to see where that field continues to grow and evolve over the next few weeks, months, years. We were talking with Tessa Grossman earlier this week on the podcast, and one of the things we really hit home about was, when you look at strength and conditioning, or when you look at physical performance, there's a lot of other factors that can influence how an athlete performs. And I'd imagine from a sports science standpoint, there's a lot of different factors that impact, how much force someone pushes into a force plate or how good someone's vertical jump is. It's not always just the physical. Sometimes it's all the other things that we don't consider. I'm curious, Ryan, in your experience, have you been able to notice any trends from a sports science standpoint? The kind of thing where it's like, hey, I could tell that guy didn't sleep good last night, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit on some really good points there. We try to, be objective with everything. And of course, subjective information is incredibly important, and that kind of data still matters. But we try to take that in a way that we can also make that meaningful as well. So if an athlete's filling out a questionnaire, oftentimes that may not be as objective as a wearable device, let's say, but sometimes it can make just as much of an impact if you're able to turn it around and use it in a meaningful way. So I would say, I guess, kind of to lay the basis for that question, so much comes down to the relationships that you have with the athletes and the interactions that you have on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that in speaking for myself, that I think is one of the most important things that anybody really working in sports performance or working in coaching, one of the most important things that they can keep at the forefront of their mind is to have elite interactions with athletes all day, every day. Like your goal is to have an elite interaction every single time that you actually sit down and talk with an athlete, or do anything more than just saying good morning and how are you doing. You're trying to build that relationship so that, one, they trust you and they're willing to be open, maybe at times when they're a little bit more vulnerable, or in times where they may not confide in others. And when I say confide, it doesn't have to be something big, but something like, in their mind, they could see opening up about something as, I'm exhausted, or I stayed out last night, or man, I feel like I'm not bouncing back, or hey, my hamstrings are sore. They could see that as a threat to their playing time if they feel like they share that to the wrong people. But if you build a really strong relationship around the data that you're collecting and the interactions that you're having with those athletes, they're more willing to open up to, with those things. And you're able to then hopefully maybe support them in such a way that we can make those things better. We can mitigate some of the struggles or the fatigue or whatever else they're dealing with. But the second thing also is maybe you can just pick up on those things without them having to tell you. So of course, that's the beauty of collecting some of that data ahead of time, or with wearables, is sometimes you get that information before the athlete even opens their mouth, which is great. But at the same time, sometimes they don't give you that information, or sometimes they may not fill it out as honestly as possible. But knowing that athlete really, really well and how they are on a day-to-day basis, you're able to actually pick up on those things just by how they walk in the room, just by how they say hello, how they go about lifting weights, how they go about prepping themselves. If you see, another layer of that is in terms of trends you'd mentioned, is sometimes it's knowing that if an athlete is a little bit off one day, sure, you may want to go check in with them, but you also know that you could push them away that way. And as you get to know that athlete, you might realize, okay, I need to wait to see 2, 3, or 4 days in a row of something being a little bit off before I go to make an intervention, or before I go to talk to them, because that's the way that they would prefer to be handled. So kind of a circuitous way of answering that, but so much of it stems back to the relationships and trying to get to know the person so that you can actually then utilize whatever information you're collecting, whether it's objective or subjective, to actually make an impact on them.
Yeah, I think that's such an amazing point, Ryan. At the end of the day, I love to look at the numbers and I love to see the trends. And, as we were talking before, I work with a lot of people who have injured their ACLs or other things in their knee, and we do a lot of return to sport testing. And, my personal battery, I really like the single leg vertical jump left versus right, single leg hop left versus right, triple hop. I like a single leg squat assessment for strength and endurance. I do hamstring and quad strength at multiple angles of max isometric. I do a lot of different things like that. And I like to look at the numbers, and I like to look at the data. And I like seeing my, greater than 90% symmetry, or my, 70%, hamstring to quad ratio, or whatever that way. But ultimately, none of the data really matters if the athlete looks at you and says, hey, I'm not ready to go back. Because if they're not ready, they're right. They're not ready.
Right.
And I think that is so often missed when we talk about anything relating to sports and data science. We often look right at the numbers and we say, hey, look, the numbers are good. You're good to go. But when we sit down and we actually have a conversation with people, sometimes they're not ready. To put it in a little more context, I had an individual I worked with over the summer who crushed their return to sport testing. I mean, one of the best numbers that I've ever seen, 95+% symmetry on everything. Hamstring to quad ratio was above a 0.7, and usually we look for a minimum of a 0.6. So I was thrilled. But this individual said, look, I'm not confident in my knee. I don't trust it yet. And I just feel like there needs to be a little bit more done here. And it was the kind of thing that, we did a few more sessions, because guess what? If they're not ready, they're right. And I think that goes back to exactly what you just talked about as well, is the importance of having conversations with people and having the day-to-day interactions. Because if you aren't communicating with the person in front of you regularly, how do you know how they're doing? How do you know how they're feeling? And I don't care if you're at the middle school, high school level, or if you're at the professional level, if you do those simple things, like have good quality conversations and gather information about someone really well, it's going to make you far more effective. But forget the performance talk for a second. I just think it's you being a better human and caring about the person in front of you instead of just what you see on the field.
Yeah, no, for sure. And to that last point is, we're probably our best selves as athletes. If you're an athlete or as a practitioner, we're our best selves when we are truly our best person. I firmly believe that. And there's gonna be instances in our career or as an athlete where you've buried a really big hole, you've dug a really big hole and you're buried. And you may not get to be your best self because that's just what the job necessitates in that moment. But ultimately, trying to get back to that balance is what eventually gets us, the best out of ourselves when we're there. I mean, at the end of the day, life happens, so there's going to be times where you are buried, but we're always, whether again with ourselves or when we're working with our athletes, we're trying to be cognizant of that so that we can get the best out of them. It's funny that you're talking about that athlete, not being ready, even though everything is pointing to them being ready. The flip side of that and of what kind of the anecdote I gave earlier about okay, get the subjective and talk with them. We've had instances like one, this past year, with an athlete that was hell-bent to get back on the field and was crushing the majority of their testing. Everything looked great and everything they were saying was great. And then as we were going, a couple things started falling off, but they weren't related to the initial injury. Or we don't believe that it was related. But eventually come to find out there were some things just downstream that again, unrelated to the specific injury, but things downstream that were happening, but that I'm assuming did not want to share because they did not want to slow down their timeline. They were hell-bent to get back. It was incredibly important to them, and everything else, the actual injury itself, the injury site, everything, the rehab process was going so great, but something down the chain was causing issues. And it finally came to a head where that became an obstacle that we've had to overcome. But it was one of those things where, looking back at his data, it was like, man, actually kind of saw this happening, but probably didn't give it enough credence because he was reporting that he felt great, fantastic every day. And honestly, the intent in the weight room was great. The intent on the field was great. So I think when possible, getting all aspects, getting all angles of it is the ideal, right? Then you hopefully don't miss anything. If the athlete reports feeling poorly and their data is poor, then we could probably make a very easy decision. And the opposite is I believe is true in most cases as well. If they're reporting feeling great and the data looks great, then we can feel pretty confident about proceeding. It's when we get the mismatch that, we have to make tough calls, and that's just part of it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I love how you kind of brought up the flip side of that as well, because, as you were talking, I immediately thought of a specific individual that I've worked with there who, timeline wise should be back to what they want to do. But as we mentioned, the testing wise, not there yet. So it can certainly fall one way or the other. And, I think part of it too is sometimes I think we live in a era of information overload, if that makes sense. Like, if you pull up force plate data, I've pulled it up in Excel before, and there's thousands of rows populated for like a counter movement jump. So it's one of those things where I almost feel like we can end up in an analysis by paralysis kind of situation with it, where we have so much data and so much numbers and we can track so many things that we often miss those low-hanging fruits that we can get from, a simple conversation with talking with someone. A lot of times if I'm evaluating someone who comes to me with an acute injury, I would say at least 85% of what I'm about to do comes from just communicating with them about what happened and really getting a full picture of the story. And I think the same is true from a sports science and sports performance standpoint as well. Is, if you sit down and you actually have conversations with people about their entire life and not just what they do as an athlete, but what they have going on outside of here. I know we were talking earlier about, you've got a young puppy and puppy's keeping you busy. But, what if you're an athlete? I don't care if you're a high school, college athlete or pro athlete. What if they've got the dog? What if they've got the girlfriend or the wife at home? What if they've got kids? What if they're not getting much sleep at night? What if they've got a stressful situation going on at home or something came up at home? Like, all those personal things are going to impact how they perform on the day-to-day, and I'll call it their overall psychological readiness to perform, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's funny, it kind of reminds me of, so I track my own data, of course, as a sports science guy. I train hard, and I fill out a wellness survey every day, and I have my wearable tech. And with the wellness survey that I do, I boil it down to just two questions. One is just how sore am I today? And the other one is what is the vibe? And it's not to be like keep my youthfulness or whatever with the hip term. But for me, I wanted to find a combination of mood and energy, because I felt that, like, if I'm, for lack of a better term, depressed, like if I'm not feeling great mentally, my energy is going to be down, and vice versa. Like if I'm feeling motivated, excited, ready to tackle the day, fulfilled, all those things, my energy tends to be up no matter how tired I am. I'm less looking at capturing, am I tired, like I want to sleep? I just want to see, like, what's my overall well-being? What's my psychological state? So, it's funny that you mentioned of like trying to capture that psychological well-being. Like for me, that one score kind of sums it up. And I found also that when I really dig myself a nice big training hole, and I've probably overdone it, and my chronic fatigue is really high, that vibe tends to bottom out for a long time. And it's taken me a long time to figure that out. But even though it should be intuitive, but that's kind of, I see it very similarly for, whether we use that specific language or that type of technology or those questions with our athletes, the same type of approach of just trying to catch the mood and the vibe of where they're at, so that how to help best support them through their day. And taking a step back to also just what you were talking about with getting all of the information you need to make those types of decisions. A big thing that I think that really helps us here, and we're very fortunate to have, is to have a performance team of folks that are all there to support the player. And one of our, overarching themes for our organization is collaboration. It's a word that you're going to hear all over the place. You're going to see it on the walls. It's very important to us. And in the rehab space, probably as much or more than anywhere else within the organization, you'll see that because there's so many stakeholders that can help impact that return to play case. And better than anybody that a lot of times, like that rehab, especially those long-term ones, our TJs, our shoulders, things like that, those can be some dark, lonely places for some of our athletes, because not only are they hurt, or is their day tedious, and do they do some of the same stuff every single day? Are they not doing the same thing their friends are doing or their teammates? But they're also, a lot of times you're losing some identity. Hell, like if you took me away from baseball for an extended period of time, I might feel a certain type of way, because I've been around it since I was 4 years old. And these guys the same way. It's been everything to them since they were little kids. And all of a sudden now that you're telling them that there might be 20 to 25 weeks where they can't throw a baseball, not only is there that psychological well-being, but then you got to pull in nutrition to make sure they're doing things to help their recovery, and they're not digging themselves a really big hole in terms of their nutrition and their body composition. You have physical therapists, athletic trainers, strength coaches, sports science, everybody that comes together, all there just to basically field all that information, share, exchange, and then find the best way to support the player.
Yeah, definitely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that, Ryan. Is ultimately you do have to look at everything, and all of those different factors that you just outlined can create a situation that makes or breaks someone's rehab or performance on field, or whatever metric or key performance indicator you want to look at. All of those factors can impact it. If someone's not eating well or recovering well or hitting their macro goals or whatever nutrition thing you want to look at, guess what? They're not going to progress as well as other individuals. Same thing from the sleep standpoint, the overall psychological health and just psychological well-being. As you mentioned, when you have some of these long-term injuries, the locus of control really gets shifted away from you as a person, which is really, really difficult. It's really difficult to give up control of your life and going from doing anything and everything you want to do all the way up to now I have to, depend on, a surgeon or a PT or, someone like you, Ryan, to kind of progress me and keep me in line of like, do this, can't do that. At least from my standpoint, I've been fortunate where I haven't had to experience that a ton. But over the summer, I was deadlifting and set up a little too, little off, and pulled it a little bit more posteriorly tilted in the pelvis than I should have been. Felt a loud like pop snap that went up the whole spine. And, I was in a rough spot for a little while, and it sucked to not deadlift for a month. And it sucked to, be confined to like the machines at the gym for a month, training around like some really bad back pain with ridiculous symptoms down the left leg. But that whole time I just kept thinking about, man, it'd suck even more if this was like a 8 or 9 month thing and not just a 1 month thing. And I think that's where, we as professionals need to find a way to try and put ourselves in the person that we're working with in their shoes and just try to imagine what they're going through. And none of us can really do it, but I think we need to make an effort and attempt to do it, because the more we can relate with the person and the situation they're in, I think the better we become. And the better we become at that, I think the better our data and assessments are going to be as well. If we can't, if we can't feel what the person is feeling, then how do we know our assessment is going to be accurate?
Yeah, no, for sure. And not only is it incumbent on us to try to empathize with them and to motivate them, but it also, to the best of our abilities, to set up an environment that that kind of feeds that as well. So it's not just on us and not just on that athlete, but there's also other people around them. So I mentioned the performance team, but a lot of times it's also just like the athletes in that rehab group. I mean, we had a group, we had a group this year that, when they'd go out for their activation or their stretch on the field and they'd get done with their conditioning, and a lot of times the group that's not, they don't have baseball activities, we still want to get them outside. So even if they can't even like do full conditioning because we're, we don't want them to fall or anything like that, like just get them outside, get them around their teammates. Like that's part of it. But this group, they would like do like a little like handshake line, sort of like dance line, almost like they were finishing a game. They did things that would just help lift the group up. And our rehab staff have done an awesome job of creating, trying to organically create these environments where some of the older veterans of the rehab group are maybe inviting some of the younger guys out to eat, or, mentoring. It's always a huge blessing to have some older guys in that rehab group that can provide the wisdom for some of the younger guys. And I'll tell, and I guess for some context, I didn't mention this before, but I was our rehab strength coach while being our performance coordinator my first 2 or 3 years. So it was solely me doing rehab for that first year or two, or probably 2 years. Then we had a rehab strength coach, and I was basically moonlighting as partly as a rehab strength coach during that time until we did a full transition. But at that time, what I learned, and I'd never worked with injured athletes in that capacity prior, but what I learned is like the rehab process for these longer term guys, it can actually be a real blessing for them because they learn to be professionals. It doesn't matter what age they are. And sometimes, honestly, you hate to see a guy get hurt at a young age, but when they do come in at 17, 18, 19 years old, like the thing that I would tell them essentially is, hey, like, let's put aside the injury. Like, let's take that part and say, like, yes, that is super unfortunate that it happened for you, and I wish it didn't. But this is now going forward, this is gonna be the best thing that ever happened to you. And I'm not a big fluffy guy. Like, I don't like just putting a positive spin just because. But after watching so many young guys or even sometimes older guys come through and just learning to have a routine and be regimented and being forced to do that, and then being around a diverse group of athletes of all different levels, because in rehab and professional baseball, you'll get everything from the 17-year-old to the 37-year-old, big league guys to guys that don't speak any English yet because they have yet to go through our English classes. Like, when you get that, the growth is accelerated. And sometimes it takes a full 12 to 14 months of a Tommy John rehab for a guy to get there, but ultimately they come out of it typically in a much better place professionally and seems like personally as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those things. I was actually having this conversation with someone earlier today. I find it's very difficult to put this into words. Like, it's very difficult to explain to someone who just tore their ACL or just tore their UCL, or, is heading in for cuff surgery or labrum repair surgery, whatever it is. It's very difficult to get them to grasp the concept that, hey, in 8 months from now, you're going to look back at this and say, wow, I'm in a better spot now, and I'm, thankful for this process. And ultimately, I guess the best way I can put words to it is this whole process is via delayed gratification. That's what sports comes down to. That's what physical fitness comes down to. And that's what rehab comes down to. But rehab, to me, is the ultimate reset button on it. What I mean by that is you go from a point where you can't even actively lift your arm, or you can't even actively walk on your own, and you're very dependent on others for things, all the way back to the point where you're doing your sport. And, oh, by the way, you might be stronger than you were before. And along that way, you had help from, hopefully, as you mentioned, a very well thought out, well put together interdisciplinary team. I think, as we've talked about during this time, rehab is more than just a physical thing. And as a result, you can really make it a environment for more than just physical growth and gain. So I completely echo your point on that, Ryan. And ultimately, I think, relating this back to the data for a second, the better that rehab is collaborated on, the more comprehensive and holistic it is, the better the outcome is at the end. And what I mean by that is athlete readiness, any type of subjective measure, objective measure. I think those are at their best when the rehab was at its best from a quality standpoint of collaboration. I like to think some of the little minute details that people argue about online and rehab and sports science honestly don't matter that much. What I mean by that is, if I've got someone and I want to load their quads and I chose a lunge over a Spanish squat, even though the research says the Spanish squat is a better exercise, that little thing probably is not going to matter that much. Or, if I chose to do an ISO hold with dumbbells instead of barbell, that's probably not going to matter too much. We like to pick apart those little like grains of sand in the jar of rehab and sports science, when in reality, I think we get a lot more bang for our buck by focusing on the big rocks in the glass jar of life.
Yeah, no, exactly. I like to think of it in my head sometimes, and I think of rehab this way, but also baseball as a whole, because again, I think baseball is an extreme example of it, but it's sports in general. Like when I see people throwing those stones on Twitter or X and all the other social medias about exercise selection and sets and reps, and I get that that's really easy to do because it's a myopic platform for people to just look at those specifics and you only see a sliver of what people do. But for me, the metaphor that comes to mind or the analogy is the river. If the current's going the right way, then we're probably doing things well. So to me, it's all about the vectors, everything going in the right direction. And then the more, like, another way that I've often thought about it is if you have one giant arrow, but it's made up of a bunch of arrows in between. So you could have the vector going straight up like this, but you could have a lot of different directions for the arrows that make up and compose the bigger arrow. The more we can straighten those out and get them streamlined, all going in the same direction, the better it's ultimately going to be. But if we're generally going in the right direction, we're probably pushing our athlete towards success. Now, it's just like a car or anything else. If you fine tune it perfectly, maybe you optimize. But at the end of the day, just with individual differences in humans, it's nearly impossible to optimize for each and every person. So get guys bought in, get them invested, lay out the plan ahead of time, make adjustments as you need to on the way, objectify, answer questions, do everything that you possibly can to keep the vector or keep the current going in the right direction. And ultimately, you're probably going to end up where you want to be. And especially when it comes to rehab or baseball, or I think even like the settings of of collegiate sport or high school, where you have 3 to 4 to 5 years with an athlete, is you have enough time that you don't have to worry and stress over one set or one exercise on any given day. Again, it doesn't mean you just throw caution to the wind and do whatever you want and whatever, but at the same time, you have the confidence. You should work and move with the confidence to know that if I'm just trending in the right direction with these athletes over time, we're going to get to where we want to be.
Yeah. I want to take a second, and I guess you could call it playing devil's advocate. And essentially just, Ryan, what happens when all of it is going wrong? What happens when everything is flowing the wrong direction? What happens when, you're working with someone and you can't make sense of the data? You don't understand their rehab course. You don't understand what's going on, and you can't get any information out of them. Essentially, what happens when I feel like this is always an inevitable thing. At least it has been for me. There's always one individual on my caseload, and it's a different one each time, that I feel like nothing is going right with. And it's always a very difficult spot for me to find myself in, kind of looking at that situation and questioning a little bit of everything. So what do you find yourself doing when you feel like things are just not going right or not going the direction you see them going?
Yeah, no, for sure. And you're right to play that side of it too, because it does happen. Especially when you work with a lot of athletes, they don't all go smoothly. I think the first and foremost thing is just to lean on others. So it could be something, like if we're talking about specifically like, hey, I'm just not connecting with this athlete really, really well. Like they're not taking to my coaching or my style or the communication that I typically do, I have no problem leveraging another staff member. So even as a rehab strength coach, and it was my responsibility to work with rehab athletes, if one of our other surrounding strength coaches could connect with that player, at a higher level, it does not to mean that I'm just going to, shift all responsibility to that coach and put all the weight on their shoulders. But I'm going to, either go to them for help and ask questions like, hey, what would you do to connect with this player? How do you connect with this player? Or just, hey, can you be there with me when I have this conversation? I mean, perfect example is just when you don't speak the same language as a player. Like I would say my Spanish in the weight room and on the field is nearly fluent. Still, there are days that I don't know, how to connect. I definitely, though, am not fluent if we go out to dinner, if we do things that aren't baseball or weight room. So there are plenty of times where you have staff members that just, you literally don't speak the same language, and you're trying, and which is awesome. The player appreciates that for a while, but after a while, it can become frustrating if you feel like you're speaking a different language. So, again, leaning on others, I think, is the first thing. And then I think just going to work, right? Doing your own homework to figure out why these things may not be going the way that you plan. So whether that's digging into some of the data, so that might be those late night hours where you've put in a long day of work and now it's time to write a query and manipulate some data and see if you can find anything, or it might mean reading some of the latest literature that's out there. It might mean calling other strength coaches. Again, just always trying to find those ways to help the athletes. But I always go back to just leaning on the team. And we're fortunate to have a really strong performance team here. So not only are there other folks in other domains, but can go to, I know there's been times this year where I've called up one of our other sports scientists who works with our Dominican Academy players, in addition to some of our other affiliates. And one of those Dominican Academy players was here in Arizona with us. And I said, hey, man, like, I'm pretty sure he gave me 50% effort on that test. And I asked him, and he told me it was everything he got. And it doesn't look good. So, like, what would you do? And so those types of things happen all the time.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I love your point on the team because, at the end of the day, I've found that there's a lot, at least for myself, there's a lot I don't know. And there's a lot of times I go through my day and I'm like, wow, I feel kind of like an idiot right now for not knowing this. But if you don't know something, I feel like it's better to tap out and refer to someone who does. And I've found, at least in my own experience, again here, people don't really expect you to know everything. Even if you're, Ryan, who is the sports science coordinator for the Cleveland Guardians, and you've got, so many years of experience at a professional baseball level, they don't expect you to know every single thing. And I think that's what, further differentiates, the great from, the best, is their ability to say, here's what I know, here's what I have a really deep bucket of knowledge with, and here's what I don't know. And what I don't know, I'm going to figure it out and find out what the best thing for you is, as opposed to, hey, here's a BS explanation on what I think I know, but I'm not 100% sure. And then it ends there. I think of the book Be Our Guest from Disney World. Disney World, you ask a question, they're going to give you an answer. They're going to find someone who's going to get you an answer. And it's almost like I guess we need to apply the Disney World concept to the strength and conditioning and rehab world a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I was just thinking about this the other day. The times you get into trouble when you don't know something are things that you do routinely on a daily basis with the athletes that are a staple of what you do. They're a bedrock. So if you're assessing something, or you're collecting something, or you have a training method if you're a strength coach, and that's something that you guys show that you really believe in, if you can't explain why you do it or get that answer pretty quickly, that's when you tend to lose a little bit of credibility or face with the athlete. But otherwise, every other scenario, more often than not, that humility and vulnerability that you show by just saying, like, hey, you know what, I actually don't know, or hey, that's not my area, but I know who knows, who eats that stuff up. Go talk to that person, or let me go talk to them for you. I've never found that to be an issue, at least to my face. Maybe they walk away and they say, like, hey, he doesn't know nothing, but more often than not, we end up getting the athlete the answer they're looking for. And you may have earned yourself a little bit of credibility, and you've also had an opportunity to maybe lift up another coach as well. When we're all working together, like we're supposed to, like in our academy, right? We have several strength coaches. At the moment, we just have myself as sports science, but in spring training, there's 5 or 6 of us. Guys still find the people that they trust, and to be honest, it happens with me a lot. Of guys that I worked with on the strength and conditioning side a few years ago, most of them are not in Arizona anymore, but when they come in for rehab, a lot of times they're not used to me being in sports science, so they come to me for a lot. They may even want to talk S&C, and I'll do it a little bit. I'll entertain it because I'm still a strength coach and I still care about them. But if it's anything to do with their plan, not only do I defer to the strength coaches because that's what we need to do, but also it's an opportunity to continue to help build relationships across the staffs and across the departments to show that we're all in this together. And I just wanted to add one other thing, but you spoke on earlier, just feeling like you don't know everything. I think that's a really good sign, right? And it can be a scary one sometimes. Like I would say in sports science right now, there's a little imposter syndrome that has come along, for the first 2 years where it's like, I have no business doing this. But one, the organization has trusted us to work in sports science, and that's confidence boosting. Two, there's a lot of people that are there to help us grow. And three, there's then the part that is now it's up to me to make sure that I can fill those shoes and not feel like an imposter. So, we can all figure out where our weaknesses are and then go to work to try to build those up. Right. And I know that's something that you obviously do on a daily basis for your athletes.
I'm far from perfect at it, Ryan, but I'm trying day by day.
That's all anybody can ask. That's all they can ask.
Brick by brick. Ryan, I feel like you and I could probably talk all night long at this point and, continue to go down the rabbit holes that exist between the worlds of sports science and rehab, and really just how a holistic view and mindset applies to those two. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything that we might have missed so far today?
No, I mean, I think we talked about a lot. Like you said, we could probably do it all night. I would just probably, I always like to go back to the mental health thing. If I have the opportunity to, when I have a platform, which I'm very grateful that you've given me the chance to speak a little bit tonight. So I do just want to end with that. Personally, I've gone through my mental health journey as most of us have, and one of the biggest things that has come out of that is realizing that we're not alone. Every one of us goes through our own version of it, and sometimes we feel like we might be the only ones who are going through it. But chances are the person next to you, across from you, the person that you pass at the store, they're going through their own. So one, just trying to bring some compassion and grace every single day for others around us, but also trying to bring that to ourselves as well, so that we're not constantly beating ourselves up. I spent way too long in my life being very resentful for all the things that I'm not, or thought I couldn't be or wouldn't be. Things started to change when I started to just give myself a little bit of a break, right? And then also reach out to others for help when I needed it. So those are the last two things I would probably leave others with: is you're not alone, and also get help if you need it. There's nothing wrong with that. We all need some coaching. For some of us, that's in the mental health space to try to make us a better person so that we can be better professionals, husbands, wives, fathers, sons, all those things.
Yeah, I love that. I love that advice, Ryan. And, one, I appreciate and respect your vulnerability and willingness to share that with people. And, I will say I've found, at least for myself, the more open I am about that sort of thing with people, the more open they are with me about it. So I've found it's a game of give and take. And if I tell people, look, I'm having a rough day, I'm exhausted right now, I didn't sleep good, and kind of explain my situation, the rest of the day goes a little bit more smooth, instead of leaving them to wonder and just guesstimate why I'm so miserable and cranky. Or maybe I'm just hangry because we've got to get those meals in here. So no, I completely understand that, and I think that's a great point. Ryan, for people who want to find out more about you or check you out online, where can they find you at? You seem more like the MySpace generation, if I had to guess.
I mean, I am of the MySpace generation. I don't know that I can log in there anymore. But yeah, no, I'm on all major social medias. This year's been an interesting one for me. I've definitely pulled away from a lot of S&C and sports science stuff on some of the major platforms. You'll mostly find pictures of my dog, or photography, or mountain biking, or my own training. I'll put out some stuff training wise, but I'm always happy to connect with people to talk about any of those things or other things as well. So I'm on Twitter or X, Instagram, LinkedIn. If you search my name, you'll find me. There's very few Ryan Fairs in the world, so I think you'll be able to find me. But yeah, reach anybody if anyone wants to chat, just reach out and I'll get back as soon as I can.
Awesome. Really appreciate that, Ryan. We will link to all of that in the description below as well. So that way, if you didn't quite catch Ryan's Instagram handle or anything like that, you can just click there. Ryan, I really appreciate your time today, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, man. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.